From 1800 to 1900, the population of the United States increased over 1,300%. In the world, in the same time frame, the population increased 60%. Now, there's a number of factors that can explain this increase, but imagine if you're living in one single nation where every 100 years your population will increase by over 1,000%. You'll suddenly be dealing with the looming specter of overpopulation, crowded cities, and nightmares of living in extremely crowded cities that might cause many of us to long for a return to peaceful and serene rural areas. But what is the real story behind this process of overpopulation? How exactly does it occur? Why is it we have some people that are conditioned to live in very cramped urban areas and yet others that would never accept it? Why do we also have places such as Ireland where somehow we had a great population increase subsisting on potatoes alone with an unfortunate system? What's the real story behind hive cities and how do they play into the nightmare of overpopulation? We go back to the 1960s. The novel Make Room by Harry Harrison, of course a science fiction novel, written in the 1960s to warn about overpopulation. But how exactly does overpopulation occur, and what would be the nuances of living in such a civilization that have allowed it to happen? What's really the nightmare behind it, and why is it something that we would not want to find ourselves locked within every single day? Harry Harrison claims that he got the idea to write the novel Make Room by talking with a man from India who had warned him about the dangers of overpopulation. There's even a comical portion where the man also told Harry that perhaps he should invest in rubber and some sort of form of contraceptives in order to prevent overpopulation from occurring. But it is intriguing to think of the fact that, according to recent figures, that the population of India has surpassed China as being the most populous nation in the land. And there are well-documented reports, and if anybody's watching that is from India, what's your perception of life in a land where there is a very extensive population? There are certain areas in the Western world, as we think of it, where there are extremely populated cities, but certainly nothing to the point of reaching overpopulation. Although it's safe to say that there are certain people that are willing to live in certain areas with unique conditions that you may not have in other areas. Right now, at least, you still have the individual choice, for the most part, in terms of what you're going to live with and what you're going to deal with every single day. But why are we focused on overpopulation? We look in the growth of India's share of world population, and we see how since 1800 the world population stated to be around 1 billion, and now here in 2025 it's increased to over 8 billion. That's still only an 800% growth over 200 years. And here we see how India has grown in its own population and how it comprises a portion of the world population. The film Soylent Green from the early 1970s was adapted from Harrison's novel Make Room. And if you really want to see how to do a title sequence and integrate it into your movie, watch Soylent Green. Without a single word of dialogue, but merely using historical pictures, this film conveys the narrative that it's telling of this terrifying situation of how usage, resource waste, and a crumbling civilization creates this terrifying situation of overpopulation. We don't know the exact details behind it, but the pictures paint a very staggering story. Soylent Green is set in New York City, and that is no coincidence. It's set in the year 2022. Remember that it's made in the early 70s, so really you're looking at 50 years later, and the population of New York City is stated to be 40 million. Certainly far more than what the current population of New York City. Although if you look at the population count for the United States and Make Room, the original novel, it's quite similar to what the current population count for the United States is stated to be. In the film Soylent Green, we see that there is a wealthy class. Here we see the character of Simonson, who's actually one of the leading members of the Soylent Green board. What's happened in this particular world is that a situation of overpopulation has been allowed to persist, and Soylent is the only food, processed from soy as we understand it, that the entire population can consume. The film documents the efforts of Police Detective Thorne, portrayed by Charlton Heston, along with his book, or assigned academic, portrayed by Edward G. Robinson as Sol, who helps him investigate Simonson's murder. and Thorne comes to the conclusion that Simonson's murder was in fact an assassination. We see a very staggering and dystopian world, and it's incredible that they were able to achieve a lot of these shots in the early 1970s, given the limitation of special effects. It involved a lot of creative filmmaking techniques, and you get this idea that this is an impressive, decaying civilization. How exactly did this state of overpopulation come to be? We see that the police are very under-equipped, and Thorne, even addressing matters with his superior, Chief Hatcher, tries to come to the conclusion that, well, it's another murder, and we have hundreds every day that are going unsolved, and this one is going to be unsolved. In fact, the only thing the police seem equipped for in this particular world is dealing with riots. We see some of the struggles that Police Detective Thorne goes through in trying to ascertain exactly who's behind the murder of Simonson, questioning his bodyguard Tab, and the film of course makes it clear that Tab is working for somebody else who did in fact set up to have Simonson assassinated. But what's really going on behind the scenes? Why is there so much elaborate ploys being displayed? We see the manner of life in every detail when Thorne has to hop over bodies virtually every time he goes up and down the stairs in the film. And I think that's one of those little details that just shows you how terrifying and dystopian life in an overpopulated land could really be. Why is it that this situation was allowed to endure in the land? Oh, and every single building that has quarters in it has an armed guard. Another little detail that the film gets exactly right. You do get some hints, though, that there was a more built-up civilization when you look in some of the background images and some of the skylines that show you that there are some elements of more advanced technology. But for the most part, you see that everything is in a state of decay and squalor. The other interesting thing is that even the elite of this civilization, while they can afford actual food, the quality of that food, whether it's meat or vegetables, is really not very good, and yet they're paying over $200 a jar for strawberries and hundreds of dollars for meat. The vast majority of the population subsist on what's called soylent. Here you see soylent green. There's soylent yellow and soylent red, but soylent green is the most tasty of these menu options. We also see the fact that the concept of civilization has regressed quite a bit. Most of the people that Thorne talked to, namely the women who live in some of the apartments, are actually referred to as furniture. In other words, they're either assigned to the apartment or assigned to a person of importance, and essentially, as the name implies, they have been reduced to the state of property. Simonson's own furniture, who's actually assigned to the apartment, Cheryl, has very limited options. He can treat her any way that he wants to. Although she claims that he was very kind to her and was never a violent man, Thorne's investigation makes it clear that this seems to be the expectation, and that Cheryl has virtually no human rights. However, what are her options? If she doesn't stay as a piece of furniture, she'll be denied the privileges of air conditioning, running water. We even see Thorne take advantage of the privileges that Simonson had in his high living status. Now, Thorne does have his own place, something that the vast majority of the population that we see in the film doesn't have. Most people are reduced to simply sleeping on the stairs. We understand that this is a very terrifying civilization and society, but how exactly did it come into being? We don't really know the exact details, and I think that's part of the brilliance of this film. It gives you some hints, and it gives you some indications about how things happened. Your understanding is that it was simply a state of decay that occurred. Yes, Tuesday is Soylent Green Day. I always wondered why Tuesday was such a bad day for me. It was always meeting day, but wow, Tuesday is Soylent Green Day. The understanding the film gives you is that there is sufficient Soylent Yellow and Soylent Red for the population to subsist on, but it has no flavor. But on Tuesday you have Soylent Green, and that is the food that actually has the flavor that's, well, let's be honest, worth rioting for when they just happen to run out of Soylent Green on Tuesday. You also see the fact that every single person has to go and get their water ration every day. And if they don't get this water ration, then they're going to die. The dialogue makes it very clear when Sol, the book or the educated former professor who works with Charlton Heston, or Thorne's character, that if they don't get their water, they are going to die. What a status of living that this is, that these people accept this, where they're just strewn about across the street, and the best part of their entire life is on Tuesday when they get their Soylent Green. And that's really about all they have to look forward to. The vast majority of the population is unemployed, and no one really seems to have any purpose. Everyone is completely and entirely dependent on the government at all levels in this dystopian civilization. Yet there's a much more terrifying revelation that does come later in the film. And no, it's not the obvious revelation that is associated with this film, and spoiler, if you haven't heard of it, Soylent Green is people. There's actually something much worse behind it. For example, when Detective Thorne is put on riot control duty because the supply of Soylent Green is exhausted. Now, when you see later the process and the logistics that go behind Soylent Green, for example, the police force doesn't even have vehicles. Thorne doesn't have his own vehicle, he has to walk or hitch a ride on one of the body disposal dump trucks. There are dump trucks, though, that are brought in for riot control, when fortuitously they run out of Soylent Green. Of course, how could they ever run out of it? It was a mistake in transportation, the characters say in the film, but you suddenly realize that it seems to have been an induced situation to cause the population to riot. So the dump trucks could show up and haul off the people. And you suddenly understand what happens to these people later in the film once they've been hauled off in the dump trucks. Now, of course, the authorities don't care if these people are injured or killed when they're thrown in the back, and you could certainly argue, what's the practicality of throwing someone in a dump truck? It's more symbolic in the film. Certainly they could innovate better ways to just haul and detain people and then take them off to be processed at these processing facilities or the Soylent factories. But it really shows you how the entire value of human life has dwindled to zero. There's a very powerful scene that I'm not even going to show a picture of where Detective Thorne comes across a mother who has died in front of a church and still has her child, who's still alive, tied to her arm by a rope. Now he unties the child and takes it into the church, but he's very callous about the whole thing. In fact, every time you see any character interactions occurring within structures that are not controlled structures, such as the Soylent factory, you see that they're just strewn about with bodies. There's just so many people. And you really have to ask that question. How exactly would the nightmare of overpopulation really come into a state of being? Because you think about it, a lack of resources would prevent overpopulation from occurring. The only thing that Thorne himself witnesses as being a true fact is that, yes, the bodies in the Soylent factories are processed into Soylent Green. And Soylent Green, as he says at the end of the film, is people. He does talk about, in dialogue with Cheryl, that he's only been outside of the city once and only seen the countryside once, but he's not allowed to leave the city. Nobody is. She's not even allowed to leave her building. Yet later, when he witnesses his friend Sol, who decides to commit intentional euthanasia to escape this dystopian world, he makes it clear that he's never actually been outside the city. When he sees some of the imagery and says, I had no idea. I had no idea the world could be this beautiful or was this beautiful anywhere. You understand that his entire life, he's only seen this terrifying city. And the film ends with him being dragged away, trying to reveal to the world that Soylent Green is people. But the great revelation of the film is that the authorities in this film created this situation. This overpopulation was by design. You have total control of the population. Take the character of Cheryl, for example. She's furniture, she's a slave, she knows it. But her only option is to either stay in that apartment or be dragged away and live with all the other bodies sleeping across the stairway. We go from the film Soylent Green to look at the film series and story series Judge Dredd. And yes, of course, I prefer the Carl Urban version. Nothing against Sylvester Stallone, but I appreciated the fact that in the more recent film, they never took Judge Dredd's helmet off. In the Judge Dredd universe from the original comics, and it's interesting to think this has been around since the 1970s, there is a series of megacities that exist across the land. The world has been scorched by nuclear war, or some other fire from the sky, as it were. And here you have another dystopian mentality of how overpopulation can occur, because you have limited geographical areas, such as Megacity 1, which is where the Judge Dredd stories are centered. And again, corresponding with the location of New York City. That place sure seems to come up a lot, doesn't it? Within these megacities, you have these areas that did survive this atomic war, but once again, you have total overpopulation. A large population that's cramped in the cities. Now take this back to what we just looked at with Soylent Green. We understand that the characters in that film never actually left the city, to include the main character portrayed by Charlton Heston, Detective Thorne. And so they have no idea what life is like outside the city. What I'm getting at is that if somebody is cramped into a large building, or a monad, which is a term that author Robert Silverberg would use to describe one of these large buildings, although there's many different terms for them, urbmons and so on and so forth, these incredible city towers. And what you'll see depicted very wonderfully in Judge Dredd, especially the most recent film, is a very large population, an entire society and civilization living in these towers. You also have a total authoritarian law. The judges are both judge, jury, and executioner, and they also act as primary law enforcement, soldiers, and have virtually every other role in the guardians of society. They have total authority, and what you see is how they exercise that total authority. Now, since Judge Dredd has appeared in the stories and in the films, there's an argument that goes on, is Judge Dredd merely a total fascist, someone that uses total authoritarianism to maintain control? And the direct answer to that could be yes. When you have overpopulation like this, a situation that has to be created because it could not arise naturally. And that's perhaps the greatest terror of overpopulation. It is done by design. It has to happen because the authorities that be in these fictional worlds that we're looking at created it. Because if you left the population to its own devices, well, people would die. There'd be a lack of resources, people would die, the population would decrease. There would be conflict, people would die, the population would decrease. And to say nothing about the health system. Yet what we see in these films, both Judge Dredd and Soylent Green, and by the way, one thing I'll give credit for in Soylent Green is it does tell you in the details how exactly the situation of overpopulation would occur. For example, going back to Soylent Green, when Detective Thorne hooks up with Cheryl and just has a very casual relationship with her. You understand that's exactly the norm for the society. And even in the original novel, Make Room, and in Robert Silverberg's The World Inside, it's a different society. Think about that, how the different institutions of society in these dystopian lands of overpopulation encourage the situation to happen. And you understand how it becomes an incredible controlling mechanism. That is the real revelation behind all of these stories. It's not Soylent Green as people. It's that the people are under total control because the situation of overpopulation has been intentionally created. They have no other options. Every time they go out in the city every single day, they see people strewn about all over the place. They understand that could be them any moment of any day. Interestingly enough, Detective Thorne continues investigating the murder of Simonson even when he's ordered to stop, just because he's concerned he's going to lose his job. And he doesn't want to lose his rather modest and small apartment that he shares with the character of Saul. Going back to the Judge Dredd series in the megacities, there's all kinds of dystopian mentalities that occur. We have people that are dyed and reprocessed into food. We have other terrifying forms of food that are used to sustain the population. We also have the concept of the population being uneducated, being unable to read. It's interesting to think about that's also being depicted in Soylent Green, where Detective Thorne is paired up with an individual called a Book, a former professor. And what talent does this Book have? He can read, and he can do analytical processes in his mind. You realize that while Detective Thorne is actually a police detective, he doesn't have that ability. He actually has to interface with another individual, Solomon Roth in the film, to even conduct police investigations. It's really intriguing to think about that. You see these little details in these films and these stories about how this dystopian civilization of overpopulation occurs. You see the individual that's been stripped of their ability to even interface within the civilization. They are completely and totally helpless. They have no other options. They have no other resources. The ability to interface as an individual making their own decisions, or even within the civilization, has been stripped away. And if you want to read one of the very best Judge Dredd stories, the one that I recommend that really tells you the truth about the dystopian nature of that world is the story of America. And it tells you the truth behind the character of Judge Dredd and what the situation really is in Megacity 1. Going back to the concept, though, of monads, or urbmons as they were called, from another science fiction novel written by Robert Silverberg, where we see this principle of these gigantic high-rise buildings in the novel The World Inside, where the majority of the world population is forced to live within. And if you read this novel, it actually spells out exactly how this situation came into being and how it's maintained every single day. The society says that everyone is supposed to procreate every day. Everyone is supposed to be open to sexual activity. And this is what keeps the population growing. The entire population lives in these gigantic urban monads. Yes, and of course when you consider what exactly does the term monad come from? Well, it comes from monadnock, a natural terrain feature that just happens to resemble something. We'll get to that in a little bit. But imagine these gigantic high-rises where hundreds, thousands, millions of people live within. The novels even make it clear that the farmers and the people that live in the cities don't speak the same language. Author Frank Herbert also did a novel, a dystopian novel about the concept of overpopulation called the Dawsonide Experiment. Frank Herbert was the author of Dune, the most popular science fiction series of all time. And in the Dawsonide Experiment, he talks about a group of aliens that decide to put humans and aliens in a very small geographical area and induce intentional overpopulation and to observe the effects as though it's some sort of experiment. Now, how exactly does all this connect to the old world? Well, in our explorations, what we've come across is there seems to be a lot of evidence that there were incredibly large and complex cities that were built up and may well have been overpopulated. Now, I've certainly never been under the mindset that the civilization of the old world was utopian, and I've never suggested that. Now, if you want to believe that or if you want to think that in places, be my guest. I do believe there were times that they achieved a better state of balance between the individual and the society, but at no point in time do I believe that they ever achieved a state of utopia. If you think about it, it's really a false pursuit anyway, because how could you actually create a civilization that's perfect to every single individual? All of us have different desires and different goals, but you can try to balance that. But it does seem to be that in the past there were structures and there were great cities that were quite dystopian. Is it possible that during their darker times in the old world that they had decided to actually do things that we've witnessed in these science fiction films of inducing overpopulation as a means of control, or just simply as an experimental means, as we see Frank Herbert wrote about in the Dawsonide Experiment? What happens when you crowd so many people into very cramped conditions, and yet they're still sustained? In other words, they don't die off because of the conditions that you've cramped them into. They manage to sustain and, in fact, even increase the population. What happens and how do these people change? Recall that earlier in the channel we did explore the concept of hive cities. And again, you can look at these as another analogy with what we looked at in New York City and Soylent Green and the megacities from Judge Dredd. The hive cities very well could have been something from the past that did in fact exist. Now you're going to ask, well, what's the remaining physical evidence? We'll get to that in a moment, because there may well be physical evidence out there that these hive cities did in fact exist. And what were these hive cities? A series of urbmons or urban monads, gigantic buildings that stretch to the very sky, a hierarchical society. Although one of the other questions that we have from Judge Dredd is, do the elite really even escape this mentality? We've even had modern designs, granted just designs as we understand it, of things such as the Ultima Tower, which, if we look at what the Ultima Tower really is, it seems to be an actual design for a real-life urban monad from Robert Silverberg's book. And of course, the Ultima Tower was supposed to be built in San Francisco. But then compare and contrast with how the Ultima Tower, in terms of shape, compares with the concept of the hive cities that we've looked at, especially from the Warhammer 40K franchise. And suddenly you see many overlapping parallels, many similarities, many disturbing concepts for how people would be forced to live in a dystopian world. And many people would simply believe that's their only option. Well, resources have diminished, and yet somehow the population's still increasing. I better do as I'm told, or I'll lose my job and I'll be living on the lowest level of society, literally and figuratively. So they really flash it in your face when you live in these dystopian worlds. Why would anybody design something such as the Ultima Tower? What would really be the purpose behind it? How do we even go about constructing such a thing? Now, I'm oftentimes amazed at how people tell us in the comments about what's possible and what's impossible. Well, if we could go to the moon back in the 1970s and we don't go to the moon now because we decide not to, why couldn't we build a structure such as this that's 10,000 meters tall? We just simply need to put the effort into it. We just simply need to plan it out and make it happen. Is this really a design that somebody submitted as a concept? Or is this merely reviving a design that came from the past? Could someone build an Ultima Tower in San Francisco? Now, I haven't been on the ground in San Francisco since 2012, but as I understand it, let's just say there's some challenges with the surface area. Perhaps building a gigantic tower or what becomes a hive city is a way to escape this. Maybe what we're seeing did actually happen in the past. And yet there are references to things such as the Ultima Tower that did happen. For example, the Tower of Babel. Now, a lot of people will say, well, you didn't interpret the Bible properly, but why are there all these different accounts about the Tower of Babel? And it does go beyond the Bible. There are other accounts that state that a very large tower was constructed in the past. Now, was this really the Tower of Babylon, or was this the tower of some other civilization entirely? A lot of the illustrations that we have and a lot of the details and some of the other accounts from these details give us the indication that these were colossal structures, that these were real-life versions of what we saw in design concept with the Ultima Tower. But understand that the Ultima Tower is just supposed to be an architectural concept. No one's really looking to build an Ultima Tower. But in the past, did somebody build a Tower of Babel? A tower that reached to the very sky? A tower that just happens to have all the same features that we looked at with this dystopian concept of these urban monads? And was there only one tower? Or were there many towers that appeared in this distant past? Or was it really such a distant past as we've been led to believe? Could there be some other entire series of stories and historical accounts that we're missing that might tell a much more disturbing story about how far humanity had fallen in the past? And what's the evidence that these urban monads may have once really existed? Well, we call them monadnocks, which just happen to be the origin of the name of the monads. A monadnock being a natural terrain feature, and it may well be a natural terrain feature, but yet it somehow just seems to resemble, if you use your imagination, or don't, a very large foundation structure. Now again, I'm not suggesting that these are definitively buildings or the remains of structures. They just look like they may be. But it's ultimately up to you to decide what these could be. And I'm certainly open-minded to the fact that maybe these aren't the remnants of colossal structures at all. Maybe they represent something else. Incredible megaflora and megafauna of the distant past. And you may recall in our colossal trees exploration, perhaps that's what they may have been. Now, of course, the mainstream assures us that's not the case. These are all natural geological rock formations. These are volcanoes, or there's some other very reasonable explanation behind these monadnocks. There just happen to be quite a few of them, many more of them than you might well be aware of. And it seems to be that there are many that remain in existence across all the major continents that are actually populated. At least all the major continents that we talk about every time we do explorations. But what's really the story behind this? Was there an overpopulation process and policy that occurred in the past? Was it an indication of just how far the old world had fallen in its darkest times? And where exactly did this fear that we have of overpopulation come from? Certainly we understand that in more recent times, our fear is not overpopulation, well, unless you live in India or China, but everywhere else we're concerned about underpopulation. Or does it really matter? Are the numbers that we're given even that accurate? What do you see? What do you witness every day when you live life? And perhaps that was the greatest terror of the film Soylent Green and the elements that we see of the city in Judge Dredd. Everyday life is affected and terrifying by overpopulation. But what are your thoughts? Did this really occur in the past, or is this just all a coincidence? Is this just all from the imagination of writers? Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Today on the Restitutor Orbis channel, we're going to be examining the question of population. Population is what drives everything behind a civilization. Every building that's been built, every road that's been laid, it's all in service of the population. And yet in the 21st century, we know that population is considered by many, whether it's a military, a company, or even a university, to simply be a human resource. But are people really just a human resource, or does population tell us a completely different story? In our explorations, we've noticed that there are many discrepancies with our accounts of population, whether we're looking at the cities of Boston, Atlanta, or Lexington, Kentucky, or just anywhere in particular. We notice that the population seems to have a very rapid increase, especially when we look at that questionable time frame of the 1800s. In today's exploration, we're going to examine the facts that we have from the mainstream account and try to determine what's the cause of these discrepancies. And here we have Ellis Island, supposedly the port of entry, although just for the second and third class immigrants, because the first class could simply pay their way past it. Well, let's begin our exploration. Thank you for joining me. We begin by looking at this animated map of the United States, and this shows us how the population density has increased over 200 years, from about 1800 to 2000. Interestingly enough, we can see that the areas that are being shaded into darker colors indicating the increase in population density matches the mainstream account that we've been given, which is of little surprise. And I will say that this little animation displays the population growth in various areas in accordance with the historical account that we've been given. For example, here we see San Francisco as it's growing up, and we see the rest of the nation slowly spreading westward. The United States is most interesting to us because of the fact that it does have a very constrained timeline for its growth as a nation and its growth as a population. Remember that everybody that came to the United States were either descended from the original colonists or they were all immigrants, regardless of where they came from. So we're going to examine that account. And we're looking specifically from the years 1800 to 1900. The United States is the most populous nation settled 1800 and after. Now, we do have other nations, such as Canada and Australia, New Zealand, that were settled in a rather constrained timeline as well. But the United States is most interesting to us for a variety of reasons. The United States is most interesting, though, because of its population and how fast it grew in certain select cities. Now, we have indicators of population. We go off of records and accounts from the government. These may be accurate, these may be inaccurate. And I'm not suggesting a conspiracy, I'm merely stating that we have human issues that we have to consider, human errors. We have photos and images, and typically they come from the records and accounts that are maintained by the government, so we have to keep that in mind as well. And then our only other source of information for these indicators is oral traditions. Now, how reliable are oral traditions? Well, I've often said on the channel that I tend to put more veracity behind oral traditions. And why is that? Well, because they aren't centralized and they haven't been managed by people who are lifelong bureaucrats and generations of bureaucrats. Now, I have nothing against bureaucrats, but as you'll see in this account that we're looking at, we'll see that bureaucratic errors and errors made by bureaucrats have caused some, how shall we say, questionable outcomes with where our true population is. Well, let's take a look at some of the cities that we've explored on the channel over the past year and see exactly how the population changed from 18 to 1900. Here in Boston, 1824,000, and by 1900, 560,000. That's an increase of over 2,000% in 100 years. Now, you're thinking, well, there's all kinds of explanations for that. Boston, it's on the northeast portion of the United States, it's a major port of entry into the nation, and it's also one of the earliest settlements, and yes, that all makes sense and that all adds up. Still, within a 100-year time frame, that is an exceptional amount of population growth, especially by percentage. Let's go to New York. 1800, 60,000, 1890, 1.5 million, and 1900, 3.4 million, for a total growth of 5,500% from 1800 to 1900. Quite an exceptional amount of growth, although it may not be too surprising because, again, we have the major port of entry to the United States. We have the largest natural harbor in, some would argue, the world in New York City. So, again, it makes sense and it adds up, at least from our mainstream account. Well, let's go to another city. Let's take a look at New Orleans. 1810, earliest recorded population 17,000, and 1900, 287,000, for a growth of 1,565% in 90 years. Very impressive. But again, New Orleans is an older community, an older port of entry off the Gulf of Mexico. We can justify and explain it by the fact that, yes, people would be arriving at these ports of entry, and they would have sufficient time, even if it was constrained over 100 years or less than 100 years. Now let's take a look at Nashville. 1810, 1,100, and by 1900, over 80,000 people. A growth of 7,200% in 100 years. Very impressive for Nashville, especially since we're looking at a city that is not on a major waterway. It's not even on one of the Great Lakes, although we can say it runs off a river, so that would make sense. But quite an exceptional growth of population. And very interesting when we consider that we've looked at Nashville in a very in-depth exploration, and it's a representation of the South. Well, let's go to Cincinnati. 1800, population of 850, 1900, 325,000. A growth of 38,000% in 100 years. An unbelievable and impressive amount of growth. And again, a city that's not on a major waterway. Yes, it's on a river, but it's not on an ocean, it's not in a gulf. It seems to be a little bit more difficult to explain. No wonder I've gotten so much negative feedback from Cincinnati concerning explorations there. Oh, well, such be life. They had a massive population growth. Let's go to St. Louis, 1810, 1,600, and by 1900, 575,000. Another massive growth of 35,000%. So you're looking and you're seeing that this is not just one isolated city. Virtually every city that we've explored, and the older cities, seem to have more of a natural growth, whereas the newer cities, the ones that were founded or really started growing after the 1800s, they seem to have an exponential off-the-charts growth, unless we're to believe that 30,000% growth is natural. Let's look at Des Moines, one of my favorite cities to explore. In 1850, 500 people, by 1900, 62,000. A 12,000 percentage increase in just 50 years. I wonder what they could have done with 100 years if Des Moines had been settled earlier. Very impressive growth again, and once again we simply have its presence on rivers, and we're to explain that as being this reason for all this population increase. Now, of course, we also have to consider all the other challenges, but we're overlooking that right now, even though many of these were frontier cities. San Francisco, 1848, 1,000, and by 1900, 342,000. Another 34,000 percentage increase, and this only in 52 years. So with San Francisco, it continues to give us the impression that these cities grew up very quickly. And oddly enough, some in 100 years, some in just 50 years, we see tremendous population growth. And now we want to take a look at the larger picture, because we've just looked at a couple different cities that we've explored, although we haven't explored San Francisco yet on this channel. We'll be getting to it. Let's see how it compares between New York City and San Francisco. Well, here we have a 5,000 percentage increase in New York City in the 100 years, and then in just 52 years in San Francisco, it was a 34,000 percentage increase. So what are your thoughts on this? Let me know in the comments. Is this something that can easily be explainable by what we're given in our mainstream account, or is there something more going on here? How significant are these particular figures of exponential growth, where we're looking at tens of thousands of percentage points for cities in the Midwest out to the West? U.S. immigration statistics, does this explain this? According to the 1900 census, 76.2 million people lived in the United States. 10.3 million, or 13.6%, were foreign-born that came from Germany, Ireland, Canada, Britain, Sweden, Italy, Russia, Poland, Norway, and Austria. Why would anybody want to leave Canada? I mean, there's so many wonderful people in Canada. Got William Shatner, Michael Wincott, Old World Exploration, Catherine Mary Stewart. I'm just speculating. Why would anybody want to leave Canada? But bottom line up front, immigration does not alone explain this massive increase. In that entire time frame, we're looking at 10 million immigrants. That doesn't explain this exceptional growth. And we're going to be stepping back and looking at the overall population numbers for the United States and how it increased from 1850 to 1900. Very odd, though, that we see all these cities that just seem to start from nothing in 1800 and then they grew exponentially. And here, as we look at Ellis Island, we're told that many of the immigrants had to pass through here before they entered the United States, although we have another account that tells us that the first-class passengers, or those who actually had money — why would anybody with money want to leave Europe or anywhere else? Don't ask. They could bypass Ellis Island, and they didn't have to go through the examination process. Not exactly sure what really happened, and we can't really ask any first-hand accounts. We do have some images, and oddly enough, we're always struck by how organized Ellis Island looked, and I have to say, it looks a little bit less busy than the local driver's license examination station on certain days. Of course, that depends what state you're in. If you're in California, though, yeah, it's a little bit more busy than that. Although maybe that's changed. My information may be dated. There was a 1921 fire, though, that because of careless smoking, the U.S. Census records from 1890 were lost. Oddly enough, this is stored in the U.S. Department of Commerce building. The fire left an enormous gap in many families' genealogical records. So once again, we have another story of a pinpoint fire. And oddly enough, we're trying to figure out why the census records from 1890 were even stored in the U.S. Department of Commerce building in the first place. Well, it's just one of those things, don't ask, okay? They have limited space in Washington, D.C., and that's just where they stored the records. And apparently somebody decided to smoke in the basement, and that was the end of that story. If this happened in the 21st century, we'd say someone was vaping. This is what the Department of Commerce building looked like on the outside, and you can see it's a very magnificent building. Although the other interesting thing is all these U.S. Census records, which from 1850 to 1900 were stored in a slew of different buildings. What's exactly the reason behind this? Why did we transfer all the census records to multiple buildings? And you know what happens whenever you move something to include records by bureaucrats. In addition, we have a bureaucrat who made a mistake by smoking a cigarette and destroying the 1890 records. How many records were lost or misplaced? Or are we to believe that they kept a perfect track of all the records? Here's the Patent Office. So I'm asking, how accurate is the census data, regardless of what year it's from? Losing the census data from 1890 is very critical because this was the height of immigration in the United States, or so we're told. So we'll examine some images, and we have to remember, we have to ask the 5 W's with images: the who, what, where, when, and why. Because oftentimes, as we talked about in the early days of the channel, any sort of caption or association with images can tell us a different story. We're looking at San Francisco in the 1870s right now, and there's a couple different panoramas from different times in the 1870s of San Francisco. And oftentimes we see that there is very minimal activity that we see in the images. Now, does this prove anything in and of itself? No, not necessarily. I do acknowledge the fact that the photos could have been taken at a very unique time of day, or even on Sunday, which we're told they still respected the sanctity of Sunday in the 1800s, and therefore there wouldn't have been much activity. Although we would expect to see a little bit of activity on the streets, even if it was minimal, but sometimes we see an almost completely deserted city. Again, that doesn't necessarily prove anything, and we can find other explanations. It's limitations of photography, although I never find myself cease to be amazed by how photography can be so detailed in some images from certain years, such as the 1850s, and yet in other years we see very rudimentary and scattered photography that shows blurry images and other odd anomalies. So it just goes back to the old saying, what can you prove with an image? Here going to New York City, and we can see a little bit more activity on the street that we would certainly expect for the premier city of the United States and also the main port of entry, especially in the 1800s. And here we can see the world building off to the right. It just paints many different pictures, though, of what's really going on with these images of cities. And here, when we look at Troy, New York, we can see even more activity. Although we'd expect this image, if we're going off of the year that we're given when it was actually taken, is it the 1890s, is it the 1900s? When you ask that question, though, what are you really going off of? Do you know that that image was actually taken in the 1890s, or was it taken in 1920? We just don't know. We have many images, though, that give us the impression of what the immigration picture was like on Ellis Island, and we have the account that tells us that only the second and third class passengers on the ships were the ones that they really bothered to check. So I'm asking, did Ellis Island really maintain accurate records in and of itself? We also have other images of abandoned cities and towns across the United States, and there may be an interesting account behind them, whether we're in Pennsylvania or somewhere in Kansas. For some reason, I suddenly find myself filled with the urge to play Silent Hill, and I'm not exactly sure why when I look at this image. Well, I'm sure there's a reason behind it. And then we have many islands that are abandoned, and yet they have very impressive buildings on them, even in great populated areas around New York City and New York Harbor. So what's really the story behind this? These images show us that we can have abandoned areas, and they can look very desolate and have minimal activity. And indeed, we can think back to that very recent period in our history, about 4 years ago, or coming up on 4 years ago here very soon, where we saw no activity across many cities and towns across not just the United States, but the entire land. And of course, we were told it was for safety reasons. Although another interesting aspect is when we think about all the great achievements the United States had in the 1800s, there was no safety. And we can also look at films such as Soylent Green and The Omega Man, both starring Charlton Heston, where we saw different depictions of what a society looked like. In Soylent Green, where there was a special product of food being made, we saw many images of what a dystopian city would look like, one that was very much overcrowded. And indeed, it's fascinating to think that in the 1970s, we were constantly given a mainstream message that there were concerns of vast overpopulation, especially in the United States. And you could definitely say that Soylent Green was one of the films that warned about that. It was adapted from an earlier book in the 1960s, if memory serves, called Make Room, Make Room, Make Room. And the plot behind the book was that it was a dystopian society because the government and the society favored vast overpopulation because of religious reasons. At least that's what the novel told us. Yes, isn't it funny how that always tends to be the reason? In the dystopian film Soylent Green, you get to see what happens when people are deprived of basic natural resources, namely food. And yet, oddly enough, Charlton Heston's character believes that all the cities are just like the one that he's in, which is New York City, and they say the population is 40 million. And the film is very well presented, and many of the shots are very well framed to give you the impression of an area that's completely overcrowded. So if you want to get an idea of what the dystopian city would really look like that's overpopulated, watch Soylent Green. But keep in mind, there was a very particular message that was being conveyed to the population. And indeed, that message continues to be conveyed to this day about the dangers and the fears of overpopulation. Although, interestingly enough, it doesn't seem to be as reinforced as much as our other concerns. Which indeed, we will acknowledge that one of the issues within the film Soylent Green was a rapid change in the climate. And we certainly know that that's a continuing concern that we have that is reminded in our society in many different ways to this day. But what's this tell us about the images that we looked at from the 1800s? This tells us that we can have different aspects and interpretations to the images that we saw. So in other words, does seeing an image of a city that's full of people or a city that's completely deserted really prove anything? Well, that's the question you have to ask yourself. Indeed, Soylent Green features one of the most interesting opening credits that tells a wonderful story in under 2 minutes. So if you haven't seen the film, I recommend it, and it definitely gives you an idea of several of the different perceptions that the population has had, or that certain interests were trying to be communicated to the population, for whatever reason we don't know. But I highlight Soylent Green as the first example because it shows us that there are concepts and fears of overpopulation. And yet we just looked at vast population growth of over 30,000% in several significant U.S. cities. Compare and contrast that with the film The Omega Man, which they managed to film during deserted portions or lack of activity times in Los Angeles in order to convey the perception that the city was completely deserted. So complete opposites with these Charlton Heston movies. And again, we do have many images of many cities across the land from 2020, in which case we saw very little activity. So perhaps they should have filmed Soylent Green in 2020. Of course, I don't know who was really allowed to film at that time because, remember, things were very dangerous. In any event, we do have the images, though, that tell us that there could be many different reasons. So conclusion, images, video, media, it offers clues, but it does not prove or disprove anything. And we have to remember that, because if you just go off a video as to prove something is real, then I have to believe that starships can travel faster than light, I have to believe in lightsabers, and I have to believe in guys who can shoot lightning from their hands. And we know that's not the case. Let's look at the population of major nations from 1800 to 2100, and that's a projection. Now, this comes from the data that we have that's assembled for these nations, and let's really look hard at the growth. First, though, let's consider the United States. We have wars, disease, the Civil War, poor medical care, high infant mortality, which gives us about an average life expectancy of 40 years from 1850 to 1900, and we can certainly assume that it was lower before 1850. So interesting with that the United States managed to have the population growth that it did with this rather low life expectancy rate. Of course, we can explain that away by saying we had a high fertility rate in the 1800s. Well, let's actually look at the population of nations, and we'll focus on the United States, and we'll also compare and contrast some other nations at that same time to see exactly how their population has grown from 1850 to 2100. And we'll start in 1850, and we see that the reported population for the United States is 23.6 million. And we see China at that time was over 400 million, India over 200 million, Japan 32 million. And we have other nations in comparing and contrasting. We also have to recall that at this time, yes, we didn't have the advanced medicine practices that we do of the 20th century. So we have to consider that. Now let's go forward to 1875, and here we have the United States population in 25 short years increasing to 44.6 million. And oddly enough, we can see slight variances in growth in China and India, but certainly not to the same percentage increase as the United States. Now recall that there was a lot of difficulty going on in the United States. This is after the Civil War, but we're told it was a second industrial revolution. And by 1900, the United States population was 74.8 million. Now, depending on your source, there's even variances depending on what the data source is, what the exact population is. You can see a discrepancy or a variance of anywhere from 500,000 to a million. So again, we see this vast increase, almost by a factor of 2. So it's safe to say that in 50 years, the population of the United States increased nearly 200%. Very impressive. And then we look at 2000, where with the great advances in medicine and discounting 2 world wars that bedeviled the entire world in the 20th century from 1900 to 2000, population of the United States by 2000 was 282 million. Very interesting. I seem to recall looking at other sources, and it may be my memory failing me, that someone indicated the population of the United States was over 400 million, and I'm not sure why I remember that, and I can't find any source that documents that. We can see the projected populations as we go from 2050 to 2100, or whatever the year actually is, and we can see that the United States levels out, as does Indonesia, Brazil, and Japan. We do see incredible growth for Nigeria, and I looked into Nigeria and I was quite fascinated because their current standard life expectancy is around 50 years. So what exactly is the reason for the sudden growth? What exactly is the accuracy for the numbers? Who's collecting this data? Well, let's look at this other figure from the same data site. Time for the world population to double, 1495 to 2078. And interestingly enough, we see a lot of white space here on this particular presentation. In other words, just a lot of years where nothing was happening. For some reason, this reminds me of some other product or some calendar that I've seen before. I'll have to get back to that in a second and stay on my point. I just want to depict here exactly how population has increased, and this is worldwide population. And we're told that it took 309 years for the population to double from 0.5 billion to 1 billion. So from the 1490s to 1805, 309 years. And yes, we could explain that by saying we had very poor medical practices, there were wars, there were all kinds of crazy diseases running around the world from that time frame. There was also colonization, there were many other explanations for why. Well, then we look at the doubling from 1 billion to 2 billion, and that only took 122 years, so from the early 1800s to 1926. Now remember the growth that we saw for the United States, and also recall the growth that we saw for the cities. They're saying that it took 122 years, the early 1800s to 1926, to double or increase a single 100%. That's right, and that's the whole world. Then another 48 years to double from 2 billion to 4 billion by 1974. So a very conflicting account that we have here, especially when we look at the unbelievable and astounding growth figures that we have for many different U.S. cities, especially at the time frame that we had for them. So what exactly was going on, and what exactly does this tell us? Well, here we go from 4 billion to 8 billion, and that took another 48 years. So oddly enough, we can see that to increase 100%, even with all of our incredible technology and medical advances, it still takes about 50 years. But you look at that account that we saw, the United States managed to grow much more, at least as a nation, almost 200%, or 300%, depending on what figures you want to go with. Oh, now I think I know what this blank piece reminds me of, where we have a bunch of time and nothing really happening. Yes, this reminds me of the cosmic calendar. The cosmic calendar that was presented from our channel's scientific consultant, Carl Sagan, when he did his great television series Cosmos. Let's look at the cosmic calendar. Yes, the cosmic calendar, where we compress billions of years of history into a single calendar or a single year. And this is done for the purposes of allowing the population to visualize exactly how much time has passed. Oddly enough, whenever we involve science, it seems to increase time and distance. It also seems like it's full of a lot of hot air. Ah, hot air. It's been a long time since I've been on the show. Would you like me to present the cosmic calendar to your viewers? Ah, yes, Carl, go ahead. Well, the cosmic calendar, as he stated, is simply a way of summarizing the date and information over time. You have a single month, which represents many different years. You have a single day, which represents many different years. And indeed, if we were to take this cosmic calendar, which goes from January through December, you could put it on a football field. And on that football field, you would see that just the size of my hand would equal all of human history. That is why we have so much time across the world. That is why we can explain things occurring over such a great period of time. Indeed, it's how we defend the concept of evolution. Evolution's a fact. It really happened. Evolution is how we went from tubes to caveman. And remember that cavemen were an earlier evolved portion of humanity. But over a significant number of years, we can see that cavemen finally evolved. And cavemen managed to evolve into members of outlaw motorcycle clubs. And that completed the final step of human evolution. And so if you think how we went from tubes to cavemen to members of outlaw motorcycle clubs, you can see that evolution is a fact. It really happened. What are your thoughts on the theory of evolution and the cosmic calendar? This is how the cosmic calendar displays evolution. Evolution is something that we've all been through, and this is how we've evolved. So conclusions. The United States population from 18 to 1900 increased over 1,000%. However, most cities founded after 1800 grew at a rate of 10,000 to 39,000%. The world population took over 120 years to increase 100% from 1805 to 1927. And finally, the U.S. Census data from 1890 was lost. Based on these facts, we can see why we have such a conflicted account and why we have theories such as incubator babies, orphan trains, and a diaspora disguised as immigration. It all comes down to the fact that there's no census data from 1890. It was lost.
Don't you think I know that? There was, but not anymore.
So how does the mainstream account for these vast discrepancies in data?
War. War never changes.
Welcome, and thank you for joining me for today's exploration into the mystery of incubator babies. We have many different rumors mixed with supposed facts about what happened in history, about the development of the incubator, and then the display of many babies in incubators at World's Fairs and on Coney Island. Today's exploration, we're going to be examining these accounts and trying to determine exactly what happened, along with potential theories on what's behind the mystery of the incubator children. Let's go back to the beginning and look at the problem of premature and congenitally ill infants, which we're told is not a new one. Now, I've gotten away from looking at Wikipedia articles on the channel, but in this case I'm going to make an exception because they have a pretty decent summary here. As early as the 17th and 18th centuries, there were scholarly papers published that attempted to share knowledge of interventions. It was not until 1922, however, that hospitals started grouping the newborn infants into one area, now called the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit, NICU. Naturally, there's an acronym. Before the Industrial Revolution, premature and ill infants were born and cared for at home and either lived or died without medical intervention. In the mid-19th century, of course, when else would it be, the infant incubator was first developed based on the incubators used for chicken eggs. Dr. Stéphane Tarnier is generally considered to be the father of the incubator, or isolette as it is now known. First I've heard that term. Having developed it to attempt to keep premature infants in a Paris maternity ward warm. Other methods had been used before, but this was the first closed model in addition. He helped convince other physicians that the treatment helped premature infants. France became a forerunner in assisting premature infants, in part due to its concerns about a falling birth rate. Interesting how we continuously hear about these concerns, and especially during that time frame. After Tarnier retired, Dr. Pierre Boudin followed in his footsteps, noting the limitations of infants and incubators and the importance of breast milk and the mother's attachment to the child. Well, I'm glad they noticed something that was so obvious. Boudin is known as the father of modern parentology. Perinatology. There's all these great medical terms. I got to give them credit, though. They're a lot more creative than the architectural terms that we have. And what is perinatology? It is maternal fetal medicine. So that's more of a descriptive term. And his seminal work, The Nursling, I'm not going to try it in French, became the first major publication to deal with the care of the neonate. Another factor that contributed to the development of modern neonatology was Dr. Martin Cooney and his permanent installment of premature babies in incubators at Coney Island. A more controversial figure, because what else would he be? He studied under Dr. Boudin and brought attention to premature babies and their plight through his display of infants as sideshow attractions at Coney Island and the World's Fair in New York and Chicago in 1933 and 1939, respectively. Infants had also previously been displayed in incubators at the 1897, 1898, 1901, and 1904 World's Fairs. So as you can see, we have something very suspicious going on here that warrants a deeper exploration. So now let's go to the Smithsonian Magazine, another one of our favorite, trusted, reputable sources of information, to look at the account of Martin Cooney. The man who ran a carnival attraction that saved thousands of premature babies wasn't a doctor at all. Martin Cooney carried a secret with him, but the results are unimpeachable. Oh yes, it sounds so dramatic. Oh, and there's a picture of him right there, holding a child, premature baby who was on view at Coney Island attraction. An exhibition, no less. Nurses in starched white uniforms and doctors in medical coats tended to babies in glass and steel incubators. The infants had been born many weeks premature and well below a healthy birth rate. Stores didn't make clothes small enough to fit their tiny skeletal frames, so the nurses dressed them in dolls' clothes and knitted bonnets. A sign above the entrance read, "Living Babies in Incubators," in letters so large they could be read from the other end of the Chicago World's Fairgrounds, which took place over 18 months in 1933 and 1934. Always in Chicago, it seems. The infant incubator exhibit was built at a cost of $75,000, worth $1.4 million today, and was painted in patriotic red, white, and blue. And let's not forget what was going on in 1933 and 1934, the Great Depression, an event so terrible that Americans couldn't find work and people across the lands were suffering due to the economic depression, the Great Depression, of which has never been seen before or since. The men in charge were leading Chicago pediatrician Dr. Julius Hess and Martin Cooney, who was known across America as the Incubator Doctor. Cooney was a lugubrious man, and that's a word you don't see often, an adjective that's not typically used. Basically, it means he's sad or he appears sad. In his 60s, with thinning gray hair, a mustache, and a stoop, something he jokingly attributed to a lifetime of bending over babies. Of course, Cooney and Hess employed a team of 6 nurses and 2 wet nurses. Martin Cooney had run infant incubator exhibits in which premature babies were displayed to the public for more than 3 decades, most famously at Coney Island in New York City. He had long been regarded by desperate parents as a savior, one who offered medical help to babies written off as weaklings by mainstream medicine. Little side note here, it should be noted that eugenics was really coming into the forefront, supposedly, in the early 20th century. And there were many doctors and part of the mainstream medical establishment, if there is such a thing, that stated that a lot of these infants should simply be left to die, because if they were allowed to live, it would weaken the species. No, this did not start in the 1940s with that terrifying regime that we hear so much about. This mentality started well before that. That's where that terrifying regime supposedly got the ideas. But who knows what the truth is? That's what we're told. But for Hess, who was accustomed to carrying out his work in a more conventional hospital setting, this was a career first. The exhibit was a hit with the Chicago public, who paid 25 cents and flocked by the hundreds of thousands to see the babies. Why is that, one wonders? To celebrate the success of their facility, Cooney organized a homecoming celebration on July 25, 1934, for babies who had graduated from the incubators at the Chicago's World's Fair the previous summer. Of the 58 babies Cooney and Hess had cared for in 1933, 41 returned with their mothers for the reunion. The event was broadcast live on local radio and across the fairgrounds. Well, of course it was. On the radio program, Cooney's exhibit was portrayed by the announcer not as a frivolous sideshow spectacle, but as an invaluable medical facility. The incubator station for premature babies is not primarily a place of exhibiting tiny infants. Instead, it is actually a life-saving station where prematurely born babies are brought from leading hospitals all over the city, just for the care and attention that are afforded. The place is spick and span, with doctors and graduate nurses in constant attendance. Interesting, almost sounds like a commercial for White Castle. Because of the sideshow setting in which he operated, Cooney's career had always been controversial. Well, of course it is. An effective doctor? That's naturally controversial. Many in the medical professional, interesting, viewed the incubator doctor with suspicion, others with outright hostility. Wonder why. The New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children had repeatedly accused Cooney of exploiting the babies and endangering their lives by putting them on show. And is this the same New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children that advocated eugenics? It's a discussion for another time. None of the complaints was sustained. Who wrote this? And by the 1930s, Cooney was finally being taken seriously as a medical pioneer. Cooney's professional collaboration with Hess marked a key stage in his habilitation. But while doing research for my radio documentary, Life Under Glass, which is being broadcast on NPR stations around the country this August, and my book, Miracle at Coney Island, I made an incredible discovery about a man who has a claim to have changed the course of American neonatal medicine. Here it comes. Cooney was never actually qualified as a medical doctor. Throughout his career, Cooney said he had studied medicine in Leipzig and Berlin. However, I could find no evidence of Cooney, or Cohen as he was known then, having studied medicine at a university in either city. Wonder why this is. To become a physician in Germany, one was required to write a thesis. Things haven't changed that much at all, have they? The U.S. National Library of Medicine has copies of the German records. Librarians could not locate a thesis written by Cooney. It's obvious it couldn't have been lost or anything like that. No, that possibility doesn't even cross the mind. Cooney was deliberately evasive about his date and place of birth. I have discovered that he immigrated to the U.S. in 1888 at 19 years old. And what evidence? Never mind. I'll stop asking questions. But someone at that age would not be old enough to have studied at university in Leipzig and Berlin before going on to do graduate work in Paris at the knee of Pierre Boudin. Funny way to say it. The father of European neonatal medicine, as Cooney claimed to have done in numerous press interviews. In the 1910 U.S. Census, Cooney listed his career as surgical instruments, though Cooney claimed to be the inventor of an incubator. I have been unable to find any evidence that he registered an incubator patent in the U.S. More likely, Cooney was a technician. Yet by 1930, he was describing himself in the census as a physician. Oh, you imposter. Over time, the success of Cooney's facility began to attract the attention of some of America's leading pediatricians. Right up until the late 1930s, few American hospitals had incubators, so doctors sent premature babies to him. Very interesting accounts. Cooney took in babies from all backgrounds, regardless of race or social class, a remarkably progressive policy, especially when he started out. He did not take a penny from the parents of the babies. In 1903, it cost around $15, equivalent to around $405 today, to care for each baby. Cooney covered all the costs through the entrance fees. Why not? Presumably unaware that Cooney was not a qualified doctor, pediatricians began coming to the fairgrounds to collaborate with Cooney and study the babies in his care. And yet none of these qualified pediatricians were able to figure out that Cooney was not really a doctor. Fascinating. The distinguished Yale professor, pediatrician, and child development psychologist Arnold Gesell visited Cooney multiple times at the 1939 New York World's Fair. Gesell brought a cameraman with him to film the babies in Cooney's facility. Interestingly, when Gassel wrote his book, The Embryology of Behavior, The Beginnings of the Human Mind, he avoided any mention of Cooney or the sideshow setting where he had carried out much of his research. By contrast, when in 1922 Hess wrote the first textbook on premature birth published in the U.S., Premature and Congenitally Diseased Infants, he wrote, "I desire to acknowledge my indebtedness to Dr. Martin Cooney. Of all Cooney's professional associations, his friendship with Morris Fishbein, the controversial president, what else would it be, of the American Medical Association," no, those are two things you don't see side to side very often, if ever, is the most intriguing. Fishbein was the head of the AMA for 25 years and led the association's crusade against quack doctors. The two men were so close, Fishbein sent his aspiring medic son, Justin, to discuss his career with Cooney in New York. If he had been found out, Cooney could have faced a large fine and a lengthy prison sentence. Over the course of his nearly 50-year career, Cooney took in around 8,000 babies, of whom he claimed to have saved around 6,500. While there's no way of verifying the numbers, pediatricians today acknowledge that the team of doctors and nurses which Cooney assembled was highly skilled, ensuring the babies got the best care available in America at that time. Well, very interesting, and very interesting article overall. Now, let's get to the good part since we've looked at the baseline of what the mainstream tells us, and let's consider what's really going on with these incubator babies. What's really going on with this story? Why do we have all this attention on Dr. Cooney, and why did we review this article? We know that there are pieces of information that seem to be fact in the article, and what it seems to be happening is that Dr. Cooney is a lightning rod to draw our attention. Yet other pieces of information seem to be fact. The fact that there were numerous exhibitions for decades that showed these incubator babies. The fact that there seem to be medical teams all across the country, because supposedly everybody who had a premature birth had to go through Dr. Cooney. There was nobody else. How does that make any sense? This is what we'd expect to see at the World's Fair exhibition, but this is what we actually see. Not a single incubator, but many incubators. Why do we see so many incubators when 1, 2, or 3 would be perfectly sufficient to showcase the capabilities of the equipment? Now, of course, we cover this by saying we want to show off babies. But that's the reality. They're not showing off the incubators. It's clear they're showing off the babies. Why are they showing off the babies? If you think about that and you think about what you see in this image, there are many infants and many incubators there for this little crowd of people to see. And it looks like we have a doctor who's given an overall account of what's going on to this little tour group, if you will, and we even see what appears to be a child there. What's the real story with these children? There's even accounts that there was a fire that endangered many of the babies, although they saved them all in the incubators at one of the World's Fairs in the 19-teens. And yet this didn't stop Dr. Cooney from doing this. What's the real situation with this? And why is this so ominous? The reality that there was a supposed labor shortage, especially in the Midwest of the United States, in the end of the 19th and the early 20th century. If that's true, then it seems there wasn't sufficient population to consider settling the rest of the United States. So what if these incubator babies are really babies that had been produced? And then that leads to additional questions. Well, where did these babies come from? And how were they able to bring so many of them in so quickly? It goes back to many different questions about the fact that we have photographic evidence that makes it very clear that they're not showcasing the incubators. They're showcasing the babies. And what was the true number of orphan train riders? We're told it's 250,000. Yet there seem to be indications that since it went on for so long, the number had to be much greater. What if there's a disparity in the number of babies who were in the incubators? We're told the number is 6,000, 8,000, but the article admits there's no way to know. Yet supposedly this was across the entire nation, this appeared in multiple world fairs, and this went on for decades. Do we really believe that number would only be 6,000 or 8,000, or could it be far more? Consider the original concept behind the incubator. They tell us that it was started and invented in the 19th century, and that prior to that, there was no way to care or save infants who were born prematurely. Well, was that its real intention? Or were these infants somehow produced in some areas that we don't know of, or areas that remain secret to the general population? And then they were provided or transported to all of these locations at these World's Fairs and locations across what is now the United States for display and exhibition. Everyone always refers to the incubator babies of Coney Island, but it very much was not simply Coney Island. What exactly is that individual wearing right there? That does not seem like the attire I would expect to see somebody wearing in New York in the 19th, early 20th century. But perhaps one of you historians out there could correct me on what the proper attire was. It's an interesting picture, and it looks like we have 3 infants in that particular incubator. What exactly is going on with that? Regardless, we understand that these incubators were everywhere. They were displayed everywhere. And there also seemed to be a lot of effort put into this. I also find it interesting that the sign here is a little bit more elaborate than what we typically see. And why does this picture seem strange? The actions of the people that are posing in this picture, and even the appearance of some of these people in this picture. Supposedly this is from the early 1900s. Based on the era of dress, that's what we'd think, and those are more the hats I would expect to see in the United States. Either the top hat, or the classic version of the Panama hat, or even the little exhibition, or the Expedition Smokey Bear hat. What exactly are we looking at? The gentleman, I think, who's holding the baby looks really strange. And then back on the sign itself, there seemed to be a lot of effort put into advertising this. And of course, you don't just see incubators. They weren't showcasing the equipment. They were showcasing the babies with the living infants. It seems as though this was designed to provide a selection or another alternative for labor and for repopulation. And we have many pictures like this. If these were the original mothers of these children, why would they ever allow them to be displayed like this? Even if Dr. Cooney had saved them. It just doesn't seem to match what we know of basic human social activity, or the bond between a mother and the child. This almost seems like these are people who came and they were looking for children to pick up. They picked out their children, and then they adopted them. We look at the many postcards and the images of the Cabbage Patch. And what's really the origin behind that? We're told that this is because people were uncomfortable about talking about such things as human reproduction in the 19th and the early 20th century, and so they used the Cabbage Patch and the stork to explain it. However, it seems as though there's a much more ominous meaning behind it. The reality behind the Cabbage Patch, that this was a way that they were simply providing children when they needed to repopulate the area. And that the true process was a family, a couple, or who knows, perhaps even people who hadn't even gotten married yet, went around, looked at children in the incubators, and selected them. And this image is especially ominous because here we have the children riding on a train. All the symbolism being depicted in this postcard. It seems like it's very benign and joyful. However, when we look at it for what it truly represents and what it could represent, it takes on a very different meaning. The great difficulty in accepting the fact that this could be the reality of the existence of many lineages. And none of us wanted to accept that or even consider it. But what if it's even more ominous that they were redesigning humans? We have far too many accounts of giants in our history and our myth, and supposedly some have even claimed to have discovered giants' bones, although these finds are always contested and considered quote-unquote pseudoscience. And yet there's many historical records beyond myth of giants. Even Roman Emperor Maximinus Thrax, who was a historical figure, and based on the actual conversion of the Roman measurement, he would be 8 feet 6 inches tall. And that's not beyond the realm of consideration because we have had human beings that have gotten over 8 feet tall that have been documented. Yet other evidence exists for even larger human beings. So what if the children from these incubators were redesigned human beings, either with some sort of process concerning DNA or some sort of scientific process that we don't understand? Also consider that in the Bible, the decline in ages at death. You look far enough back in the Bible, and other religious texts, of course, and it seems there are well-documented cases of human beings living over 800 years. Yet as time went on, for some reason, the lifespan or life expectancy decreased immensely, down to 200 years. And what can we say it is now? 80? 85 if you're lucky? Depending where you live, of course, we'll be told that there's a different life expectancy depending on nation, although what that has to do with it, I'm not sure. Yet that's what we're told. But what if the real answer, the potential changes in our human structure and our human lifespan, have to do with the actual redesigning of the human being? Perhaps through some process of alchemy that we don't understand, or some other scientific process that we're never going to be allowed to understand. It's a chilling consideration, and it's one of the reasons that this is a difficult topic to cover. Yet we have a lot of evidence and a lot of accounts that indicate this may be the case. Think of the channel's exploration into the underground. When we think of the existing population of the civilization that came before ours, Tartaria, or call it whatever you want to, and the many bones that we have underground indicating that millions were killed. Somebody died down there, and then somebody arranged the bones like that, indicating there was some mass killing that occurred. We have many difficult terms for it now. And then we also consider the images that we have of different types of humans or human-like creatures, such as the blimmies. Were they the result of some sort of genetic manipulation or tampering or alteration? And then, of course, there are many other creatures. And then we wonder even about the very plain disparity that we have in human beings today. Compared to this, the differences in human beings today is very, very minor. Also, when you take accounts in of other creatures that supposedly existed. Also, going back to the giants, here's Robert Wadlow from Alton, Illinois. Guinness Book of World Records is the tallest human being. The picture in the middle, some people contest saying it's fake, and yet that individual who appears to be in that coffin looks about to be as tall as Robert Wadlow. And then what about the skeleton to the right? Is that real, or is that an altered image? Things suddenly become a lot more cloudy when we consider this, and we consider these conflicting accounts. Robert Wadlow was very well documented. What about the rest of this? What about the myths and the stories that we have of different human beings in the past? And what about the myths and the stories that we have of giants and of people having much longer lifespans? There's too many accounts of this to simply ignore. Of course, our mainstream will address this by saying that no, everything we tell you is true. There were dinosaurs 65 million years ago, and that's not absurd. And yes, they were tremendously large creatures, and they lived on the land. So we can't use that old excuse that, well, we only have large creatures in the water, such as the blue whale, because that facilitates large creatures in the water. But we'll justify this by saying things were very different in the environment, and that's what facilitated the lifespan of large creatures such as these, with the size and mass that you couldn't possibly imagine. And isn't it funny how much we remember in school the way that they pushed dinosaurs on us, and even in fiction to this day, and science fiction being mixed with it. And we'll be told that this is a picture of an individual next to a dinosaur bone. But are we sure it's a dinosaur bone, or could that be a bone of anything, or could it be something else entirely? Remember that we just have a picture here. So what does this really tell us about these incubator babies? It seems clear that there was some more nefarious purpose by displaying all of these infants in all these different locations. Were they just displaying infants that you could select as part of a repopulation plan at a national or potentially international level? Who knows how widespread this was? Or were they introducing an altered human being into the existing population stocks? Can't really disprove that. Can't really prove it either. However, they're very interesting considerations. What do you think is really going on? Let me know in the comments. We're going to continue this exploration, and we're going to try to answer the questions, whether it's through theory and conjecture based on available evidence, of how the situation came to be. Where did these babies come from? Where did the orphans on the orphan trains come from? And how did we end up in this situation after the last reset, whether it occurred in 1850 or a year that was much earlier? There's much more exploration that we have to complete, and we will, with the 19th century and understanding how the situation came to be, and looking for explanations of what happened to the civilization before us.